COVID-19 has governments scrambling to respond, and it could change the dynamics in some of the world's conflict zones, from Syria to Yemen to Libya. Will armed groups try to take advantage of the chaos caused by the virus, or will it put them on the defensive too? This is Roundtable. Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. COVID-19 is having a drastic impact on what are normally the most stable societies. So, what about war zones? Will the outbreak change conflicts in unexpected ways?
The UN says the coronavirus pandemic is the world's biggest challenge since the Second World War. Experts fear millions could die if the disease spreads in active war zones with weak health systems, such as in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and other regions.
Today, I am calling for an immediate global ceasefire in all corners of the world.
The UN chief has reiterated his call for a global ceasefire to focus international efforts to fight what he calls a bigger enemy. In response, in Colombia, the ELN insurgent group announced a unilateral ceasefire as a humanitarian gesture till the end of April. In Yemen, the Saudi-backed government and Houthi rebels had initially agreed a ceasefire to prevent a coronavirus outbreak. In Syria, fighting slowed in the early stages of the coronavirus crisis, as all parties involved feared exposing their fighters to mass contamination. But experts fear terror groups like Daesh will exploit the chaos caused by the virus. Some Western nations are withdrawing troops from Iraq due to the risk of contagion. Some analysts say this could weaken the international Daesh coalition. With so much at stake, what will the landscape look like in conflict zones during and after COVID-19?
Joining us via Skype from London, we have Mukhtar Karim, who's the founding trustee and CEO of the Lady Fatemah Charitable Trust. We have Isabelle Arradon, who's the research director at the International Crisis Group. And we have Jalel Harchaoui, research fellow at the Conflict Research Unit at the Clingendael Institute. Many thanks indeed for being with us on the programme. Let me start by asking you about the UN Secretary-General's call for a global ceasefire. Do you think that is likely to be heeded?
I think that could have a fairly mixed reception between countries that are already facing an outbreak of COVID-19 and perceive that danger, to other areas where it's not as open and apparent for them. And if any side is seen to be taking the early stance in this, they could be perceived to be politically weaker amongst their followers and taken advantage of. So in areas where this is a true reality, like, for example, Gaza, it presents an immediate opportunity for the politically averse sides to take the humanitarian stance and grab the opportunity to help people out in need. Gaza, for example, is a very densely populated area. It has very low intensive care units. The incidence of multi-generational families and availability of clean water is quite low. So here is an ideal opportunity for the different sides to take a unified stance and take a stand against the pandemic. Other areas like Yemen, for instance, may take it differently, in that if sides are warring for control of territory, to have one side call a ceasefire or have measures to contain COVID may not be taken seriously, and the opposing side might just jump in and say, hey, here's our opportunity to grab some more territory, exert political control, and take advantage of the situation.
I must say it's been a very important call from the UN Secretary General Guterres on the 23rd of March. And it's been quite interesting to see a number of groups have actually followed suit. For example, the ELN in Colombia, or the communist rebels in the Philippines. We've seen also a group in Cameroon who has decided to take seriously the risk of spread of COVID-19 in the Anglophone areas. So clearly some groups have listened to it. At the same time, it's of course much more complicated than that. Even in Yemen, so far, it's still at the level of rhetoric, and there is still ongoing violence, which is incredibly worrying, of course, because the potential humanitarian catastrophe could be on top of years of war there. And we also see in other contexts like Afghanistan that the violence has actually increased in the rural areas compared to February.
In the specific case of Libya, the UN happens to, it was already tired and losing a lot of its impact before the coronavirus pandemic emerged. The Berlin summit of January was in many regards a failure because the arms embargo, not only was it not observed, but it was violated even much more quickly with an exponential growth in terms of the arms flow into Libya. And on top of it, and it's in ways that are related, there's a rejection of any kind of ceasefire on the part of both parties, to the point of the UN Special Envoy for Libya, Hassan Salameh, resigning. And all of that happened right before the pandemic became a reality. So there's a momentum, if you will, that consists in not listening to any form of diplomacy, I would say on the part of both parts, both camps in Libya, and that logic has continued to prevail, unfortunately. So far, there's a complete disregard of the UN or international diplomacy in general.
Well, let's focus on Libya for just a moment. How has coronavirus affected the conflict there?
Well, I would say that we're still quite early in the cycle. Deaths have just begun being recorded. The population knows that the pandemic is real because all the commercial flights were shut down. There's a curfew, a pretty strict curfew imposed by both governments. So the civilians are completely aware of this pandemic. But at the same time, the military components, I'm talking about the warring parties on both sides, as I said, were committed into a logic of crescendo, escalation, let's get this done, and then maybe we'll look at the pandemic. So the military components right now are completely in denial. And as the net result is that the pandemic effectively contributes to accelerating the escalation that was in many regards going to happen anyway, because we're talking about a process that began in November when Turkey announced its new military intervention in Libya. So it's connected. The Turkish part is growing, and the Emirati part on the other side, the side of Marshal Haftar, is also growing in response.
I want to come back to Yemen in a moment, where Mukhtar Karim has a special area of expertise. But Isabelle, you mentioned Colombia, where they have actually, one rebel group has actually agreed a ceasefire due to the coronavirus.
I will talk about Colombia, but first I just wanted to add something on Libya. I think another element which has been quite interesting as regards Libya is how COVID-19 has also impacted mediation efforts. And whereas there was a lot of diplomatic activity up to February as regards Libya, it's been very slow in the last few weeks. And one element that is, of course, quite worrying is if Western governments are focused on domestic priorities, they could very well forget about conflict areas, whereas the need is over there very present as well. And it could come back very easily when things slow down in the West as regards COVID. As on Colombia, you're right. It's indeed positive that the ELN has been opened again to talks with the government of Colombia. Having said that, our early warning bulletin, which we issued on Friday, Crisis Watch, shows that in March there were still elements of violence involving the ELN. So we're not yet at the stage of peace between the government and the group. We are just looking at a ceasefire. And it's been also very worrying to see Colombia closing its border with Venezuela, with, of course, the impact on the population of Venezuela, already suffering huge economic distress over the last few years.
And you mentioned Afghanistan as well, where we've seen the opposite, an increase in violence.
Yes, Afghanistan is very interesting because, as you know, there was a US-Taliban agreement at the end of February, and as part of this agreement, the idea was to have a decrease in the level of violence, and indeed that happened. However, in March, we've seen the opposite. We've seen a return to the levels of violence in the rural areas, with the Taliban attacking Afghan forces to a very high level, and we've seen also very slow progress as regards the intra-Afghan talks. And this is something we, of course, want to see progressing. Again, like Libya, I'd say there's been an impact on the international peace efforts. Some of the involvement from the US Special Envoy, for example, has been of a technological device. People can't travel, basically. So it's also putting restriction and constraints on a very nascent peace process. So that's something we ask, of course, for everyone to watch carefully and to support.
And let's turn to Yemen then. Clearly a complicated situation, but there have been some signs that a ceasefire, well, might not be close, but has been more close than in recent times.
From our conversations with our local groundspeople, there's been a lot of optimism, although the latest ceasefire broke as soon as it was announced, or days after it was announced, and the optimism soon faded thereafter. But as a number of my fellow guests have said, you know, until things start becoming a reality on the streets and people start seeing the actual impact of COVID, what has so far been a silent killer in the West and, you know, obviously originating further east, has not quite hit reality in Yemen. But like with the other areas that have been discussed, Yemen is not, you know, the strongest economy with a stable government and strong infrastructure and healthcare. It comes over 5 years of absolute desolation of their healthcare system, ineffective government that doesn't control the whole country, a healthcare system that's in absolute tatters and that has already had to cope with a cholera pandemic. Now, the difference with cholera being it's very visible, it's food, you know, it's contained to food, as opposed to COVID, which is, you know, silently carried. It can be, you know, transmitted very innocently without, you know, fully realizing what's happening. With this country, let's look at the Western response to COVID, and you say, okay, social distancing. Even in peace times, to have social distancing has a huge impact on people's mental health. Now imagine trying to restrict people's movement further in a wartime situation or something that's a newly declared ceasefire. It can be extremely impactful on their mental health well-being and the way their emotional well-being rebalances. Again, you know, the government and healthcare directives to wash and keep antibacterials to hand, where the availability of fresh water isn't common, or sometimes it's a luxury to even have a supply of fresh water. Enforcing such measures could be highly problematic, and even with the best will in the world, difficult to have universal access to fresh water, even if for the pure basis of, you know, keeping the population safe. Add to that a porous borders where, you know, the inflow of arms and rebel movements cannot be regulated. I think it does present itself for a really problematic situation, God forbid, if the incidence of COVID were to increase in Yemen.
And I imagine there are points that Mukhtar made there that can be applied to other war zones too. For example, the decimated healthcare systems you might see in certain places.
Yeah, I recognize a lot of what my colleague has said, thinking about Libya. Libya, for instance, if you look at the Tripoli area, you have it's probably almost 200,000 people who are displaced, so they cannot access their homes. They are sometimes living in garage or makeshift shelters. You have also all the sub-Saharan migrants who are crammed up in detention centers that are under-calibrated for the number of people. So you definitely have a decent section of the population that cannot physically apply social distancing, and you definitely already have an electricity problem and that is only going to get worse as temperatures rise. And of course, electricity is linked to the distribution of water, particularly in Tripoli. So you could imagine water becoming scarcer and scarcer as we go into the summer. So none of that has happened already, but you could easily imagine the progression becoming much more painful in the coming weeks.
And how do countries where there are several different factions manage to agree and enforce something like a lockdown in order to protect people?
Well, it's a good question. I think what has just been described by my fellow speakers here is so right. Those who are displaced or refugees are particularly at risk. What we've seen is, because here in a way you're talking about how do you enforce lockdown, but then of course in context of camps, etc., people are already somehow confined. However, they are very much at risk if the disease starts to get in. I'm thinking about the camps in Bangladesh, where we have about 1 million Rohingyas. I'm thinking about Al Hol camp in Syria, where the situation is already atrocious as regards sanitation, especially for the women and the children who are there. Of course, we mentioned Yemen. Currently, we are estimating that there are about 70 million people who are asylum seekers and refugees worldwide, according to UN statistics. All these people are very much at risk. And I think in relation to armed groups, what is very true and what we've seen over time is that it has to do with political calculation. Will they have an interest in enforcing ceasefire, or will they have an interest in continuing fighting? Will the international community turn a blind eye as to what is happening, or will it continue to actually force the different groups to come to the table? It will depend on the different contexts, what happens next. But it's extremely worrying, I would say, in the medium to long term, if there is not pressing attention to this different context.
And you mentioned countries focusing on their own domestic agenda rather than perhaps looking outwards. Does this then offer some kind of opportunity to potential armed groups to make some kind of headway? Do countries looking inward risk welcoming, or perhaps not welcoming, do they risk allowing other groups in?
Well, the way I see it is more like Libya. If the West is not paying attention to the situation at its borders, of course, it gives a free rein to the armed groups from within the country. The way I see it in relation to governments being focused on domestic issue is more potential new localized violent conflict in places if people start pushing back against COVID-19 measures that they feel are not fair. We've seen that in Kenya, for example, where there have been some clashes between people and security forces, several dead. We've seen also pushback in India. We've seen a demonstration in Niger where also people contested the COVID-19 measures. We've seen delays in election in various contexts, for example, in Sri Lanka, and if that drags on over time, then you could see elements within the population contesting the situation. So that's more at this level that I would say one could see emergence of some localized violence.
That's really interesting way of looking at it, because aside from the warring sides or the government's ability to enforce a lockdown or ability to provide good healthcare or access to basic needs, and I think food will become a huge area for control of resource as well as water, as it always has done. But in terms of the makeup of some of these families, you've got the family units headed by the mother, who may not have any formal education, who has just come to terms with the death of her husband, children grieving the death of the father, the orphans being in high trauma, and then having yet another issue to cope with that is far less visible, that they have far less education to realize the extent of what is happening, and then have unfair or unequal government or rebel-led measures to try and contain or keep that position from spreading the violence worse. So it lends itself to a multifaceted problem where COVID is coming on the back of some very, very difficult issues as things are, without anything else making it more complicated.
Can I just say something about the enforcement of the lockdown? In Libya, I think it tells a lot of new things about the conflict for people who are wondering about the nature of this war. The civilians are very willing and committed to self-regulating and applying the lockdown. They don't need to be policed. They understand the risk and they understand the rules. So the problems of enforcement turned out to be much smaller. And this is a great way of realizing the huge extent of the divide between the civilian population that doesn't like the war in any way versus the warring parties. And of course, those are not focusing on fixing the health system or anything like that. They're just interested, for the time being, in continuing the flow of weapons and mercenaries from the outside, and that implies a constant exposure to new sources of the coronavirus and continuation of the war. So there's it's a reminder of how foreign, I would say, the civil war, or how internationalized the civil war is in Libya. The population would love to just follow instructions and treat the coronavirus as a priority. But the foreign states, for instance, continue ejecting foreign mercenaries and weapons for the time being. Hopefully it will slow down, because at some stage I think they will realize that the consequences on themselves are also very, very tangible and serious.
I think you're absolutely right there in terms of a civilian population that's tired of armed conflict around it. And I don't think there's any civilian population around the world that wants to see the continuation of armed conflict and further loss of lives. But the practical challenges of being locked down at home to a population that is highly dependent on food aid, that has very few economic resources to rely on, that is highly traumatized, and whose mental health is stretched and challenged as it is, from both self-regulating to stay at home, staying safe at home, having the right antibacterial measures and knowing what to look out for in COVID and the right education system, and also knowing that there is a supply of food available for when their resources run out. I think that is the wider challenge, rather than the armed groups having to tell them not to roam the streets and further spread the disease.
We mentioned
You're
earlier
very correct. There's a food crisis hanging on Libya. It's not a reality day to day yet, but because of all kinds of economic phenomena, including an oil blockade that was introduced just before the pandemic in January, we could definitely, the Libyans could discover a much more severe shortage in terms of food in coming weeks. That shortage hasn't materialized yet, but you're very correct. It could become a reality, a very painful reality within a couple of weeks.
So we mentioned the distracted international community. I wonder if then, lastly, the bigger threat is a potential humanitarian disaster rather than perhaps the rise of an armed group like Daesh.
I think the humanitarian disaster is indeed looming, and this is something that we need to take into account very carefully, and of course it's been mentioned here, the potential impact on women, on children, on populations that are already particularly at risk in situation of displacement or otherwise. I think ISIS, on the other hand, always thrives when there is chaos, when there is opportunity. And what we've seen is that already in some of their newsletters, they've been saying COVID-19 offers an opportunity to strike. the West is being distracted, and it may be an opportunity to basically attack again. Of course, the usual places will probably be Syria, Iraq, or places in the Sahel for groups to strike, but there could also be elements on their own deciding to use violence in line with ISIS motive. We have seen foreign troops leaving parts of Iraq because of COVID-19, and they were there to push back a resurgence of ISIS. So what are the implications if indeed the effort to keep ISIS at bay is weakened? I think it's important that the West keeps an eye on these issues, and Iraq, of course, is very fragile at the moment.
Thank you so much for joining me. To all my guests, Mukhtar Karim, Isabelle Arradon and Jalel Harchaoui. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.